What is GATT? GATT was an agreement among 23 countries known as the contracting parties. Its goal was to reduce trade barriers and remove tariffs between countries. Now, let's take a trip back in time to the year of 1945, shortly after the end of World War II. After World War II, many countries were in an economic crisis and turned to raising trade barriers through the roof in order to protect themselves while attempting to rebuild. GATT rose out alongside the Bretton Woods institutions, now known as the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. The contracting parties on GATT came together, wanting to give a boost to trade liberalization and correct the legacies passed on by earlier protectionist methods. 2 years later, in 1947, GATT was born. In the same year, the International Trade Organization was shut down, leaving GATT as the only multilateral institute governing trade. And for those of you who don't know what multilateral means, it's when two or more parties, or in this case countries, participate in something. Throughout GATT's life, it conducted 8 meetings around the world, which were called rounds. Each round was designed to negotiate different trade issues and international economic disputes. Every decision had to be agreed on by a consensus. During the 60s, GATT worked on the Kennedy Round. In this round, the anti-dumping agreement was made. This agreement prevented countries from dumping their exports into another country at a lower price. Between 1973 and 1979, the Tokyo Round involved 102 countries. This round was the first attempt at reducing trade barriers that were not in the form of tariffs. There were problems with this round, however. First of all, many issues regarding farm trade were not resolved. Secondly, many agreements were not met, as not everyone in GATT agreed. In 1993, after 7 years of negotiation, GATT finally had the Uruguay Round. Unlike the Tokyo Round, this one resulted in much more promising agreements. An agreement among 117 countries to reduce trade barriers and create more world trade rules was established. 1 year later, the US Congress approved the Uruguay Round, and the final act embodying the results of the Uruguay Round of multilateral trade negotiations was signed. 1 year after that, the Uruguay Round goes into effect and gives birth to, drumroll please, the World Trade Organization. The WTO is a place to negotiate other reductions of trade barriers, enforcing trade rules, and settling policy disputes. Unlike the GATT, the WTO's rules are full and permanent. In Canada, the WTO has been very influential. During the year of 2002, Canada asked the WTO to rule on the disagreement between Canada and the US on tariffs on Canadian lumber. A panel of 3 WTO officials heard the arguments of both sides and, in 2006, ruled in favor of Canada. They got rid of tariffs on Canadian lumber and forced the US to repay 80% of the more than $5 million it had collected from Canada. GATT and the WTO have had major positive impacts on the development of the global economic community. Many benefited from the development of global trade. Consumers got things for cheaper as well as a more diverse supply of goods. Producers found new markets and employment. It promoted and secured liberalization on trade for 47 years, and trade barriers and tariffs continued to be brought down. Now, like all things that have a good side, the WTO and GATT also have negative aspects to them. The reduction of trade barriers caused some textile, steel, and footwear industries to suffer from the competition of foreign nations, thus causing many people to lose their jobs. As some countries cut costs in order to get a better price advantage, many companies start paying their workers lower wages, bad working conditions, and even child labor. In countries where the main export comes from farms, the loss of barriers has a major impact on the environment. Since trade is easier and less expensive, there is a higher demand, meaning more factories and farms, ergo, more pollution due to pesticides. How is this an example of economic globalization, you ask? Easy. Each negotiation round completed by GATT and the WTO resulted in the reduction of trade barriers or the decrease of tariffs on products. These changes allowed more trade to take place between nations, which in turn allowed for the expansion of economic relations and markets as well as free trade. Now, Let's take a break from looking in the past and start looking in the present. During this year, trade is expected to be weaker due to the certain economies dealing with the debt crisis. According to the WTO, this will recover only slightly in 2014. Global trade is believed to grow 3.3% this year, which is 1.2% less than what was expected. However, this is a small improvement to last year's global trade, as economies were still trying to recover from the Japanese earthquake disaster and the nuclear crisis. Pascal Lamy, the WTO's Director General, stated, "The final trade numbers for 2012 are quite sobering, meaning exports from developed countries increased by 1%, while developing countries' exports grew 3.3%. He also stated that the rise of the debt crisis in the middle of the year proved that the decline of global trade is coming quicker than anticipated. Economic globalization is the increase of interdependence between national economies through trade and the expansion of markets. GATT and WTO were both created to manage trade and tariffs among the different nations of the world. They make decisions about trade barriers and whether or not to enforce tariffs on exports. The decisions made by WTO have a major impact on trade relations and the resources and markets that nations receive. Without rules against protectionism, the walls would be built up so high on every country that we would not be able to exchange goods without costs outweighing the benefits. Organizations such as the WTO ensure stable international markets and fair prices.